Well, I mentioned earlier that Pastor Marty and that team of 15 are in Belize working this week. I kind of checked on them this morning. Did you know that there are live webcams on some beaches in Belize that you can watch 24 hours a day at some resorts and stuff? And so I found one of them, and I went to it, and I screenshot this view this morning at 6:26 a.m., and I sat there and watched it for a few minutes. Beautiful sunrise coming over the ocean. I didn't see Marty anywhere. I didn't see him or any of the team out walking around. Well, unfortunately, they're probably not there. That is some resort, and there's probably not any live webcams in the villages where they're doing Vacation Bible School at. Okay? Pastor Steve did send us a picture a little bit earlier of them as they were on their way into worship this morning. But no, I couldn't find them. But it's amazing, isn't it, that technology has made it possible, this little device has made it possible for us to practically be about anywhere in the world instantly, right? We can be about anywhere instantly. There are live webcams all over the world. You can go on virtual vacations. Did you know that? You can go on a virtual vacation. You can through a device or through your phone, you can go walk the streets of Rome and see things. You can go visit the Eiffel Tower. You can walk through the hallways of the Louvre Museum and look at the exhibits virtually. You can watch traffic at Trafalgar Square in London and never leave your recliner. That can save you a whole lot of money, right? But we can do that. We can be at home, but then be in a far away country almost immediately. That can happen to us. You're physically here, but your attention, your mind, your heart, your feelings, they're all in some far country, even when you're at home. Have you ever heard someone say, maybe you were walked up to talk to them or something like that, and they said, "Oh, sorry, my mind was somewhere else"? You ever heard that? You ever been that? Yeah, some of you may be that right now. I don't know. I mean, you're sitting here in church, but you're scrolling Facebook or Instagram or checking out the score at the Open Championship. Maybe I didn't mean for many heads to pop up like that quick. But anyway, we can be physically in one location, but mentally and even in our heart, we can be thousands of miles away, can't we? We can be somewhere else. Did you know that psychologists have a term for this? Psychologists call this perceptual decoupling. It's a fancy word there. Perceptual decoupling, detached by your perception from where you're really at. Well, this morning, I want us to address something that I think is even a greater danger, and that's spiritual decoupling. Spiritual decoupling. Believing that you're in the right place with God when your heart is somewhere else entirely. And I want us to look at that because I believe that Scripture actually addresses this. And one place in particular is Luke chapter 15. So I want you to turn with me to Luke chapter 15. You can either turn in your Bible or you can turn on your device. I give you permission to pull it out now. You can turn off Facebook and go to your Bible app, okay? But let's look at an episode that I believe totally addresses spiritual decoupling. Luke 15 has three of Jesus' probably most famous parables, okay? But before we get into that, I want us to see the setting. I want us to look at the setting of it. To do that, we need to look at Luke 15, 1 through 3, where it says this: "Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to Jesus to hear him. And then the Pharisees and the scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' And so Jesus, spoke this parable to them, to the scribes and the Pharisees, saying," and then Jesus goes on, and he tells these three stories. He tells a story about a lost sheep that's found. He tells about a lost coin that's found. And he tells about a lost son that comes home. But then, just so that these scribes and Pharisees don't miss the point, at the end of the one about the lost son, which we often refer to as the prodigal son, he adds this twist. He adds this twist in it at the end of this story. And I want us to look at that because, most of Jesus' listeners, as he was addressing those scribes and Pharisees, most of them could avoid identifying with a lost sheep or the lost coin or even the lost son. But the older brother leaves them nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape to. And I want to look at that this morning. So let's go to verse 25. We're going to jump all the way down. At the point of the story of the lost son or the prodigal son, if you know that story, if not, you can read those previous verses, beginning with about verse 11. But it talks about that there are these two sons, an older one and a younger one. The younger one goes to his father and says, give me my inheritance now. I don't wait till you die. Give me your inheritance now. The father divides the inheritance between the two boys. The younger son takes his and goes to a far country. And it says he wastes it on prodigal living, okay? And then he ends up in a pigsty, decides it's better at the father's house, and he comes home. Father runs out to greet him and welcomes him back and gives him a robe and a new ring and shoes. And he says, kill the fatted calf. Let's have a big party and everybody come and celebrate this son that's home, right? That's where we're at to this point. Now let's pick up in verse 25. Now the older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And so he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And the servant said to him, well, your brother has come. And because your father has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he, the older brother, he was angry, would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him, and so the older son answered and said to his father, lo, these many years I've been serving you, and I never transgressed your commandment at any time. And yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who's devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And the father said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and now he's found. And then cut. That's where it ends. The presence of the older brother who refuses to celebrate the return of the younger brother, this is mentioned precisely because, if you remember verse 1 through 3, it's mentioned precisely because of the grumbling of the Pharisees and the scribes, isn't it? This is a direct shot from Jesus at those who are acting like the older brother. A direct shot at those who are caught in spiritual decoupling. The older brother, he was still at home, he hadn't left, but his heart was somewhere else. His heart may have actually been in the far country. And if I'm honest, which I really want to try to be, if I'm honest, I find myself identifying more with the older brother than any other character in this story. The guys that have worked with me over the years have probably heard me say over and over and over that the sin that so easily besets me is Phariseeism. So like it or not, I often find myself identifying with the older brother, and I so don't want to do that. And so how can we protect against that? How can we guard against being the older brother? Well, I think in this parable, it's revealed that there are 3 warning signs that we can look out for. 3 warning signs that you may be the older brother. And the first one is this. The first one is you believe you deserve a better life than others. You believe you deserve a better life than others. Now you remember when the older brother learns what's happening, it says he becomes angry and he won't go in to the celebration. His father comes out to see him, to plead with him to come in. His father comes out and the older son immediately jumps down his throat. He immediately jumps down the father's throat. You never even gave me a goat to have a party with my friends. And here this son of yours, as soon as he comes home, you throw the biggest bash ever. Do you hear his attitude kind of slip out in that? He's basically saying, look, I deserve something better than your other son. And I didn't get it. I deserve something better. Now, I told you, at first blush, just reading this story, first blush, I almost actually have to be on his side a little bit. If we think about it, don't we? I mean, his rebellious little brother gets prime rib and T-bone, and he doesn't even get goat meat. That's not very fair, is it? Our evaluation of fairness, though, we have to remember this, that sometimes our definition of fairness is based on what we believe we deserve. Don't we sometimes base our definition of what's fair with what we believe we deserve? And anytime we don't get that, it's not fair. The older brother believes that he deserves to be celebrated, and the younger brother deserves to be punished. The younger brother, the father showing forgiveness to the younger brother, just isn't fair. But remember, when we think about grace, if you know anything about grace, grace is never about fairness at all, is it? Grace is always undeserved. If all of us, if we got what we deserved, right? If we got what we deserved, we wouldn't even get goat meat, would we? None of us deserves grace, but that's what we get. But sometimes it's possible for us to resent God for when He does something for someone else that He hasn't done for you. It's possible to resent God for that. If older brothers see someone else doing better than them, they become resentful, don't they? And often they'll say, well, why them and not me? Especially after everything I've done. Why them and why not me? A little twist in here we need to keep in front of us as we're talking about how fair this actually looks and all of it. But whose fatted calf was it that was being served at this party? It was actually the older brothers, wasn't it? If you remember back early in the story, the father, the younger son asked that the inheritance be divided. So it says the father at that point divided his inheritance between both of them. He went ahead and divided it at that time. And in that day, that culture, the older brother got 2/3 and the younger brother got 1/3. So everything left that the younger son hadn't already taken and wasted and sold or whatever, everything left belonged to the older brother. So who's paying for the party? The older brother. It was the older brother's inheritance that's now being used to throw the welcome home party for the younger brother. And that's just not fair. The older brother deserves better than this, doesn't he? He's not the one that ran off to a far country, did he? He stayed at home. The older brother excelled at being in the right place. While the younger son left and he wasted his possessions with prodigal living, the older brother stayed. The older son was there. In fact, the first time we find him, the first time we encounter him, he was where? He was in the field. He was in the field working. The older son was exactly where you would expect a respectable son to be. From all outward appearances, and really that's all he cares about, but from all outward appearances, the older brother is far more respectable than his little brother. He even reminds his father, he says this, he says, look, all of these years I have served you. And it's interesting, the word there that he's used for served is the word douleo, which actually means to be a slave. So what was the older brother saying? He says, look, all of these years I've worked like your slave, Dad. I've been a slave to you. He wasn't enjoying life with his father. He was slaving for his father. He believed that he earned everything he possessed instead of recognizing it all came from the Father in the first place. His life was self-centered, just like his younger brother's life was in the far country. And, Jesus addresses this some other times too. There's another parable that Jesus told, and it's recorded in Matthew chapter 20, about a landowner who came and he hired some laborers to work in his field. And in the morning, he hired some early in the morning and sent them out. And then he came back a little later and he hired some more in the mid-morning, and they went out and he hired some more around lunchtime, and then he hired a few more in the middle of the afternoon to go out and work. He even hired some an hour before quitting time to go out and work. And then at the end of the day, the landowner paid every one of them the exact same amount. He paid every one of them the exact same amount. And those that worked all day long, what do you think they did? Well, they complained. They complained because they thought they should receive more than the others. They thought they deserved better than the others. And then Jesus kind of drives the point home where he says, life's not about getting what we think we deserve. It's about recognizing the Father's love and receiving the gift of grace that he offers us. Now, should we work for God? Should we serve God? Yes, absolutely. But do we serve and obey God to earn a better life than others? If we do, then we may be the older brother. We may be at home working in the field, but disconnected from the Father and as much in the far country as the younger brother. So one sign that you might be the older brother is that you believe you deserve a better life than others. Well, the second sign is that you believe you live a better life than others. You believe you live a better life than others. In his angry outburst to the father, the older brother quickly points out his better moral record. Remember what he said? He said, I've never transgressed your commandment. And this younger son of yours, he devoured your livelihood with harlots. I've lived a better life with him. He was furious when his father celebrates the return of the younger son because the younger son committed what he qualified as serious sins. The younger son must not be celebrated. In fact, he should be punished and even rejected because of his disgraceful behavior. You know, it's often possible to see sin in someone else's life without recognizing it in our own life, isn't it? Jesus reminded us somewhere else that sometimes we want to point out the speck in our brother's eye when we've got a log sticking out of ours. You know, in the older brother's mind, there are two categories of sin, okay? For the older brother, there's two categories of sin. There's acceptable and there's unacceptable. Or if we really want to get to the heart of the matter, the two categories of sin are this. The two categories of sin are yours and mine. That's how we define sin. Yours are unacceptable. My sins, they're just not that bad. Not as bad as yours, so maybe mine's acceptable. The younger son had committed a sin that shouldn't be forgiven so easily. All the time the younger son was off wasting his portion of the inheritance, the older son was home keeping the farm. But we got to remember, it was his farm, right? The older son wasn't working those fields out of love for his father. He was protecting what he believed belonged to him anyway. You know, every word the older son speaks exposes his self-justifying relationship with his father. Everything he says. And it may also have exposed something else. It may have exposed what was hidden in his own mind and heart's far country. His angry outburst actually includes some accusation of sins that aren't mentioned anywhere else in the parable. Did you notice that? If you read, we didn't read the first part of the parable back in 13. The only thing we're told about the younger son is that he wasted his possessions on prodigal living. Prodigal means extravagant and wasteful. That's all we're told, is he wasted it on prodigal living. But in verse 30, did you catch what the older son said? The older son accuses the younger son of devouring the father's livelihood with harlots. With harlots. Where did that come from? How did he know that? Did someone tell him that? Or was he maybe revealing the fantasies of his own heart? Did the older brother spend his days out in the field imagining the life of the younger brother was living? Did maybe he think this whole time, well, if I was him, here's what I'd be doing? Is it possible that the older brother had been at home physically while longing to be in the far country in his heart? You know, we said earlier that the older son excelled at being in the right place. Well, he also made sure to obey the right list of rules. He said, I've never transgressed your commandment. He isn't claiming to be sinless. He just thinks his sins are more respectable. And, you know, as I look at this, I think it's interesting that the father never points out to his oldest son. He never points out that his son is transgressing his commandment at that very moment. Right? Now think about it. The father had commanded the robe, he commanded the shoes, he commanded the ring, he commanded that the fatted calf be killed, and he commanded that there be this big party and everybody come and join in and celebrate his son that was lost and now it's found. He commanded that that happen, and the older brother refused to obey and join the celebration. He was transgressing his father's commandment at that very moment that he was claiming that he was better. Older brothers have this sense of superiority that's grounded in I do it better or I am better. And because they believed that he lived better, he refused to forgive his brother and celebrate the return as his father did. He did not see himself as a sinner like his little brother. You know, older brothers sometimes look at the lost and the broken in the world, and we believe that they are the way they are because they didn't work as hard as we have. You know, it's their own fault because they're just not as good as us. You know, I'm reminded of another teaching of Jesus. I think it's in Luke chapter 18. Jesus tells us about a Pharisee and a tax collector who both go to the temple to pray. And then we're told that the Pharisee prays out loud. And do you remember what he said? He said, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, especially this tax collector. You know, Jesus points out in that teaching, he said that this older brother Pharisee went away unjustified, not right with the Father. So older brothers believe they deserve a better life than others, and they believe they live a better life than others. And there's a final sign that you may be the older brother. And that final sign is that you care more for your better life than you do your father's heart. You care more for your better life than you do your father's heart. Yeah, in this parable, the younger son represents all those tax collectors and sinners, those prodigals who wanted nothing to do with God, but now they're experiencing Jesus. And the older son represents religious people who outwardly follow the rules, but inwardly they have little concern for the Father's heart. They say the right things, they go to the right places, they perform the right rituals, not to please the Father, but because they believe doing this, they believe their obedience will earn them the better life that they think they deserve. You know, the father's heart had been broken by the younger son's rebellion. And we see that throughout this parable. And we see that when the younger son finally comes home and he's starting back home down that road in verse 20, it says, when he was still a great way off, his father saw him, had compassion for him, and he ran to him and fell on his neck and kissed him. That shows the depth that the father's heart was broken, and now it's showing that the father's broken heart is now healed, and he's overflowing with joy because his son had come home. But obviously the older son cares more about himself than what brings the father joy. He cares more about his circumstances and what's going on in his life than he cares about the father's joy. He's angry that he's not getting something better than the younger son. You know, sometimes I wonder if we were God, how much complaining would we put up with? But again, this parable is intended to reveal the amazing grace of God. Because for the second time in the same day, the father has left his house to pursue one of his sons. Earlier in the day, he ran down the road to the younger son. And now here he is again, leaving the house to go out to plead with his older son. You know, that's a beautiful picture of the incarnation, isn't it? Think about that image. Think about that picture. And then think of the incarnation. That the Lord himself left his home and came to our far country in order to invite us to come back to his home. That's a beautiful picture of grace, isn't it? You know, another thing I want you to notice is in verse 31. When the Father responds to the Son, he says this in verse 31. He says, "Son, you're always with me, and all that I have is yours." And the interesting part is kind of hidden in there because our English language doesn't do it justice. That word son here is not the typical word that's used. All through this parable, the Greek word that is used for son is the word huios. That's the normal Greek word for son, and it's already been used 7 times in this parable. But now here the word changes. It changes to the word teknon, which is a word that shows fatherly affection for his child. So instead of it just really saying son, what it literally means is the father looked at him and said, "My dear child, my dear child." Can you hear the compassionate heart of the father in that? The father's heartbreak. We said his heart was broken before. I think he's experiencing heartbreak again. And you know what? The father's heartbreak now might be even deeper than when the younger son left. Because he realizes that although the older son never left the farm, he never was truly at home. Let me remind you of a few things. This man had 2 lost sons. One son was lost in a far country. The other son was lost while staying at home. One son was outwardly dirty and sitting in a pigsty. The other son was inwardly dirty and working in the field and probably sitting in the synagogue, sitting in the church with his father. Both sons rejected the father's heart. Both sons have broken the father's heart. The father must leave his house to go out to both sons and offer them grace. Both sons need to be found. Can you hear the heart of the Father reaching out to both of them? And we know that God the Father reaches out. Peter reminds us that. It's recorded in 2 Peter 3:9, where we're told that He doesn't want anyone to perish, but He wants all to come to repentance. You know, there's another way that we can grasp Jesus' point, and it's probably one of the most heartbreaking ways to look at this. That's to imagine this. Imagine what would have happened if the younger returning son had met his older brother on the road before he got back to the house and got his father's embrace. Imagine what might have happened if he ran into his older brother first. I think chances are he may have never made it home. He may have never made it home. How many broken people never reach the Father's embrace because of us older brothers in the church? How many have returned to the far country because they encountered us before they encountered the grace of God? You know, I told you earlier as we read that it just kind of cuts off there in that last verse. Jesus doesn't tell us how the story ends, and he did that on purpose. Remember who he's speaking to. He's speaking to the Pharisees and the scribes. And at this point, he's going to be looking at them because they're grumbling. Remember, their grumbling and complaining is what started this whole series of parables. And through it, as he put this twist in there about this older brother, Jesus has identified their self-centeredness and their uncaring hearts. Now what? He leaves it for them to write the end of the story. He leaves it for them to write the end of it. And what are they going to write? Are they going to come into this meal where Jesus is and join the party with Jesus and these sinners and tax collectors who he's talking to? Or will they continue to stay outside? Are they going to celebrate that God's grace is available to all? Or will they continue to think that they alone deserve God's grace and a better life? Will they continue to pretend that they are right in the right place with God when they're actually in the far country of self-centeredness and rebellion of the heart and of their minds? Or will they truly come home to the Father? What will they do? What are they going to do? A bigger question for us today is, what are we going to do? What are you and I going to do with this? Do you really have a relationship with Jesus that is healthy and vibrant? Or have you just settled for outwardly looking like a child of God? Do you have a Christian faith that is simply something to do once, twice, 3 times a month on Sunday? Or does it define every part of your life and who you are? Do you sometimes measure yourself against other people's sins? Or do you really recognize that everyone deserves God's judgment and rejoice in the fact that Jesus receives sinners even like us? You know, the good news in all of this is that even the older brothers are invited to come into the Father's house, aren't they? The Father welcomes prodigals who come home from the far country. And the Father welcomes older brothers who finally leave the far country of self-righteousness and come in to celebrate His grace. So maybe are any of us today at home in the right place, but we're experiencing that spiritual decoupling. And actually in our heart and our mind, we're in a far country, not even connected to the Father at all. You know, as we think through this parable, you may identify with somebody in it. Some of you may identify with the younger son. Some of you may be sitting there thinking, I'm the prodigal. I'm the lost son. I'm the one that's always rejected the Father, and I'm away from Him, but I realize the Father's grace and the Father's love, and I need to go home to the Father. The good news is He's waiting on the porch ready to run out and meet you. The Father loves you so much that He sent His Son to leave His home and run down the road toward our far country in order to invite us to come back home with Him. Some of you may be like I confess that I am at times. Some of you may identify with that older brother. Even though you may look outwardly like the perfect son, the perfect child, inwardly you're as disconnected as any lost one out there. Your heart and mind is in the far country, even though it looks like you're at home. Maybe that's what we need to look at today and say and confess, God, I have not really been home with you. I've looked the right way, I've said the right things, I've done the right things that I thought I was supposed to do, but inside my heart, God, I'm in a far country. I'm totally disconnected, and I need to come home to you, Father. The good news is that the Father's also on that porch willing to run out to greet us older brothers and invite us back home too. I want you to bow your heads with me right now, and as we finish up, I'm going to invite our praise team to come up and sing. And this morning, you may be sitting there, and whoever you identify with in this story, if you identify with the lost son who's the prodigal, living in that far country, the Father is waiting on you and begging you to come back home to Him. To come home. He loves you. He wants to clean you up. He wants to make you His child, and He wants to welcome you into His home. Let Him do that today. But there may be some of us in this room today that we look at it and we say, I'm the older son. I've played this game of being a Christian. I've played this game of being a church person. I've showed up and I've dressed right and I've said the right things and done the right things. But the whole time, my heart is somewhere else. My heart has never been home with the Father. And if you realize that today, the Father has come out and He's pleading with you to join Him with the celebration, to come in and be a part of His home and His family. Do that. He's waiting to run to you. So I'm going to pray, and at the end of my prayer, if you can do that right where you're at, if you need to reach out to the Father, He'll, like I said, He's waiting on that front porch. He's going to run out and meet you right where you're at. It may be that you want to talk with somebody. I'll be in the back. A couple of other pastors will be back there if you want to come and pray with one of us. Or there'll be a pastor down front as well. But above all, don't walk out of here today in a far country. Won't you come home to the Father?